Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Chair. And I just actually wanted to follow up on the Chair's line of questioning regarding the interaction between the implementation of the withdrawal agreement and the future relationship negotiations, and to focus in particular on the Northern Ireland Protocol. So a broad and general question that I wanted to ask you on this, first of all, is on the 14th of February, the Northern Ireland Secretary said, "We are absolutely clear, as a UK government, we will not be having a border down the Irish Sea. But as you'll know, the Northern Ireland Protocol is, in essence, predicated on having a border down the Irish Sea, because Northern Ireland is going to have a significantly different set of rules and regulations with regard to its interaction with the European Union's customs union and single market than the rest of the United Kingdom will have." So can you just outline how you think this is going to work in practice? Because if we've signed up to a legally binding, internationally legally binding withdrawal agreement, which is predicated in essence on having border checks down the Irish Sea, but the UK government is saying we will not under any circumstances have border checks in the Irish Sea, at what point are we considered to be in violation of that withdrawal agreement, which is internationally legally binding? Question one. And at what point would that trigger the termination of the negotiations on the future relationship, because we would be violating the duty of sincere cooperation? Maybe start with Professor Menon.
Well, the first part of that question is easy to answer. That I don't know at what point the EU would see the UK as in breach of its obligations, but under Article 12 of the Protocol, we are liable to infringement proceedings and possibly fines levied by the European Court of Justice in the event that we're seen to be not implementing the Protocol in accordance with the text of the treaty. So there is a legal mechanism already contained in the Protocol that we have signed up to and approved. And at the first hint that we're not implementing, I imagine that will be the route that the European Union chooses to go down in the first instance. And
you don't think that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland's statement on the 14th of February, which says, under no circumstances will we have checks in the Irish, that doesn't constitute a violation under Article 12 as things stand?
Well, I think the EU will probably judge the UK on the basis of what it does rather than what it says. So the proof of the pudding there will be in the eating. Certainly my reading of the protocol implies that there will have to be checks on produce going from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, and that there will be strong pressure not just from the EU institutions but from other member states to make sure that those checks are carried out satisfactorily.
Mr. Booth, thank you.
I think I'll just take a step back. I mean, you said that the protocol was based on the premise of an Irish sea border. It's based on the premise of respecting the Good Friday Agreement and avoiding disruption to the political and economic circumstances in Northern Ireland where as far as possible.
Yeah.
So I think that should be the starting point rather than saying how do we implement an Irish sea border.
It's a means to an end.
Yes.
You can't have one without the other.
Yes, but I think the question is, I think the point is, if there is an intrusive set of checks east-west, then how does that not undermine the basic objective, which is to respect the Good Friday Agreement?
Well, it's about the land border primarily, isn't it?
Well, I think that's why this issue is contentious. But I think for some member states in the EU, it is primarily about respecting the integrity of the single market.
Yeah, but the UK has signed up to something which is based on protecting the land border primarily. That was the big shift from having a UK-wide backstop to having a Northern Ireland backstop.
Yes, I think, and it is based on avoiding a north-south border. Yes. I think the question is then, how do you implement the protocol in a way that is as unintrusive as possible? I think on things like agri-food, I think everyone recognises the need for certain checks and building on possibly the checks that already exist east-west. I think for other areas of industrial goods and so on, it's going to be very difficult to see how having an intrusive east-west border is not going to undermine east-west trade and therefore undermine the sustainability of the protocol, which is not in anyone's interest, including the Republic of Ireland and the rest of the EU. So I think there are going to have to be mechanisms found to move those checks away from ports and so on. And I think looking at the de-escalation of checks, which Michel Barnier was talking about a long time ago, in terms of looking at how these things can be checked in market as part of wider UK the regulatory regime that we would normally enforce. So I think there's clearly this is a crucial issue, and I think how this is implemented has potential to derail the whole process, if I'm honest. But I think what it is important is to take a step back and recognise the objective of this is to maintain confidence in Northern Ireland of all the communities, and a system which undermines that confidence, and I think a hard Irish sea border would do that, is not in anyone's interest. So I think some of the language on the EU side in this has not been particularly helpful either.
Thank you. Mr. Bondi?
From a technical point of view, the UK is currently as if it were a member state and therefore can't, all of the rules and regulations as though one were a member state continue to apply. So there's no issue now until the end of the withdrawal agreement period. I think maybe the interesting thing is to what extent will the EU be mindful of whether or not the UK is getting ready for what is coming, and at what point does it say in that, look, you're not going to be ready for this, and therefore we no longer believe that you're going to comply with this, and so we're suspending negotiations. And from a technical point of view, Northern Ireland will in effect remain in the EU, subject to EU rules and regulations. If you want to sell between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, you will have to fill out forms. There will be checks. It is, the solution that this government agreed to in order to preserve peace in Northern Ireland.
Sorry, thank you very much. Would it be fair to say then that this is going to be a major factor in the June progress check? I mean, assuming that we stay on the basis of the current timeline. And in that case, what evidence will the European Union be looking for as proof? As you rightly say, Professor Menon, it's more important what you do than what you say. What would be evidence of this is going forward in good faith, and therefore the future relationship negotiations can continue? Because the assumption is that decision will have to be made in June, and if there's no evidence whatsoever of preparation for a border check, whether it's hard border, soft border, whatever, some kind of technical action to show that this is actually something is happening, then that, I assume, in June would be the trigger to terminate the negotiations. And what is the EU looking for in terms of evidence of action?
Well, I imagine the EU somewhere in an office in Brussels have a timeline of the actions that will need to be taken and how long they will need in order to be put in place to make the protocol work. I mean, the European Union could also, of course, suggest that we extend transition because given the pandemic, there is simply no time to implement. I mean, it is open to the European Union to suggest that as well. So it's not necessarily the case that will say, look, not enough progress has been made, we're suspending talks. They might say, look, not enough progress has been made. We understand the situation because we're in the same situation too. Why don't we sit down and talk about extending this process so we can do it properly?
Yeah. But whatever timeline we're in, the expectation will be that measures are being put in place, technical, institutional, the paperwork. Do you all agree on that, on the panel? That some,
yeah,
do we know what the UK's?
Yeah, I think the one thing
the idea of evidence of a border, because the Northern Ireland Secretary has said there will not be a border.
I think the one thing I would add is that clearly this isn't just about unilateral implementation of the UK side. There is a joint committee which is designed to implement this, and the job of the joint committee is to try and build processes which are unobtrusive to East-West trade. So I think the UK, the first job should be to try and use that joint committee to develop processes that are unobtrusive, that aren't impinging on East-West trade. So this actually, the first job under the protocol is to try and reach compromises between the UK and the EU about how to implement this, rather than the UK unilaterally necessarily implementing.
But the UK, under the terms of the protocol, is solely responsible for implementation of these measures. I mean, you're right, there's a joint committee.
It's responsible for enforcing the measures that are decided.
Yeah, but
So,
it's,
but the point is, the point is, at the moment we don't. At the moment, all it says at the moment is the Union Customs Code will be the basis for this, right? I think everyone acknowledges, if you look at this practically, that just enforcing the Union Customs Code is going to be hugely challenging in the context of the political circumstances in Northern Ireland. So the job of the Joint Committee is to try and look at how those processes can be adapted to respect the wider agreement, which also included, by the way, Article 6, which talks about the Northern Ireland remaining within the UK internal market as well. So there are conflicting elements here which have been present all along throughout this whole process, going right back to the joint report in 2017. So there's going to have to be political work done, because if you just leave this to technocrats, it will fail. So there has to be a political process that looks at how these processes are implemented, and just saying we're going to copy and paste the EU's rules and regulations isn't going to work.
Can I just drill down on that point into one aspect of the Northern Ireland Protocol, Article 10, which relates to state aid? Because there it is absolutely clear in the protocol that the full range of EU state aid regulations will have to apply to Northern Ireland, and that the UK has signed up to that. It's a legally binding contract that we have. So, and it relates, of course, to trade between Northern Ireland and the EU 27. So, if you, for example, you're producing widgets in Birmingham and selling them to the EU through a branch or sales activity in Northern Ireland, you will be subject to the full panoply of EU state aid rules. How do you see that playing out in these negotiations? I mean, do you think that's generally accepted as a condition of the talks going forward, that both sides recognise that through Northern Ireland, the UK, one way or the other, is going to be shackled, if you accept that term, to EU state aid regulations, whatever happens?
I mean,
Mr.
that's
Bondi,
what
maybe.
it says. You know, if the agreement is there and the government has signed up to it, then what the issue will be issues of interpretation. So what does this actually mean? What does this actually apply? And from there, I would think when we go to the dispute resolution mechanisms, I think the question is, in the period of the withdrawal agreement, during these negotiations, those mechanisms or those constraints will not in effect be active, because the UK remains within the general EU legal framework. So it's not as though when we're separate here at this point, but it's the day after. So I think on that point, just because it's a question of, well, what does the government do after, the UK government do after the withdrawal agreement period is closed, it's slightly different from the Northern Ireland, the Irish Sea border, where one can sort of measure progress about getting ready for it.